Nastasha Miller here, representing Science Gallery Detroit, which is an extension of Science Gallery International and a part of a global consortium of 8 amazing science galleries around the world. I'm here to talk a little bit about our upcoming program, Science of Grief, to give you all a little of the backstory about how Science of Grief came to be, and to also explain why we felt like it was important that we put this program on in this moment. So a little bit about the backstory of Science of Grief. In 2013, my brother Marcus passed away here in Detroit. And for years, I dealt with, unspeakable and overwhelming grief due to the loss of my brother. To deal with most of the grief, I would just go to my family and go to my friends and tell stories about my brother, or just talk about my sadness, in general. A few years into my grief, I kind of felt like maybe I was exhausting my family and exhausting my friends with the same stories. So I started to kind of process and deal with my grief alone. One night in Detroit around 3 or 4 a.m., early morning hours, I couldn't sleep. I was just tossing and turning. I was thinking about my brother, and I was thinking about all of the conversations that I wanted to have about him, and I was thinking about all of the grief that I was feeling. But I just didn't want to call anybody in my family or anybody in my friend circle. And I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't feel like I was exhausting them, that they would have been there for me, to listen and to talk me through that moment. But I just didn't feel like it was right of me to continue to place that on them. So eventually, I fell asleep, and I woke up the next day with this idea to create this platform where people who might have been experiencing the same grief that I was experiencing, or grief similar to mine, could be in community with other people who were dealing with loss. And I thought, what if we at the network did the Science of Grief? What if in our communities we held space and we opened a stage where, everyday people could come and say, hey, I'm grieving and I just need an outlet. I just want to talk about somebody that I lost 5 years ago or 20 years ago or 5 days ago. It didn't matter. So we did the program 2 years ago. Our first time doing it was here in Detroit in partnership with the Detroit Institute of Arts. And we were discussing for the last couple of years, how could we make this a Science Gallery network-wide event? And we just felt like right now, with what's going on in the world, where we had to shift from doing it our 3rd year in a row in a space where people could physically be together, that we should shift it to online, and we should make it a network-wide program, because we feel like, what better time than now, when everybody in the world is probably dealing, with some unspeakable grief, where we're all being affected kind of by the same thing and many more things. So there's a lot of conversations that will be had during the Science of Grief. You can expect to hear musicians and meditate a little, and hear scientists and researchers and just everyday people talk about not just how COVID-19 has been affecting their lives in their grieving process, but just about grief in general, and how to heal, and what's on the other side, or what's on the side that you're on right now. So I hope that you all find something meaningful from the program. We've had an amazing journey working with Science Gallery Atlanta and Science Gallery Dublin to put on this first iteration of Science of Grief online. I hope that you find something meaningful. I hope that you find something healing. I hope that you find something resourceful, and I hope that you find something fun. Thank you for tuning in, and stay safe.
Is bound up with mortality. We all know that. And we're used to the idea of grief as having to do with somebody who is lost. We associate it with loss. But I'm intrigued also by the idea of premonitory grief, where we experience, sometimes very vividly indeed, long before it happens, a loss that will somehow be destructive, a loss that will be corrosive, a loss that will bring us to our knees. I remember once sailing in the South Atlantic in quite a storm. It was quite a storm. And a sudden, clear perception that very logically, we were in a situation where I could die. And I remember the stab of grief I felt, not for what was being left behind, but for what I would not now experience. All the vistas of the future opening and watching them close down one by one was an extraordinary sensation, because it was accompanied by a very matter-of-fact determination that I wasn't going to let it happen, as if I could defy the storm. But I certainly was going to go down fighting if necessary. And then I went to bed because I had to be up 4 hours later. But I remember that grief. I remember it very strongly. And weeks later, it came back to me that I'd experienced that kind of premonitory grief before. And grief, as the poet says, is felt in the body. Grief makes its home in the body. And it was at a time I was newly in love, very much in love. And suddenly, for no particular reason, it occurred to me that one of us must die before the other. And it was the most piercing of sensations. You might think odd in the sense that I was, at that moment, as happy as I had ever been in my life. And through that happiness, like a spear, came the thought that one of us must die before the other. I suppose it's a sense of how frailty and value are bound up together, like two braids in a bracelet, that what we value most is what we will miss most. But it was an extraordinary moment. But I was lucky in the sense that soon after that, a poem came to me that helped to resolve it, or at least contain it. And I thought that perhaps as a contribution to this conversation, I might say the poem. I might read that poem as a contribution. It's called Learning Death. I took the title shamelessly, because bad poets borrow and good poets steal. I took the title from the very fine Irish language poet Nuala O'Connell. It was a beautiful poem called Ag Fólam an Bhás, Learning Death. So I just took the title, Learning Death. The first time I knew myself mortal, that unmistakable catch in the breath, we were new to each other still. I was stroking your face as you sank towards sleep, and said without meaning to, call me if you need me over there. Full moonlight, the square white bedroom, your eyes startling open, aftershock in the cold air of what I had just said. The crackling electric thought we took, one breath between us, so close we lay. How matter-of-fact that was, how clear. And there we were, borne up on a void soundlessly opened, shy with each other, stricken all of a sudden to know time might contrive to part us against our will. I knew what mortal meant. You might call, and I would not be there for you. Grief worse than any I had felt my life until then. Now, facing the white blank of the page, that thought again, unbidden. There will be an end to words, an end to compact breath. You shaped my face in your hands. You said, you'll be there. I'll be there. And we slept. And it's an extraordinary thing, and I don't want to edit it out. It's an extraordinary thing that's still, just out of the marks, the black marks on the white page, that moment of grief and gratitude can still ambush me. And gratitude, of course, because premonitory grief has its consolation. And that consolation, to me, is gratitude to care so deeply, to be cared for so deeply by another, for another. What a gift that is, and how it counterbalances grief.
Hello, Clodagh Tate here from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, talking to you about the history of keening. In an account from Macroom, County Cork, written down in the school's folklore collection of the 1930s, an unnamed informant tells us that keening is not known here now, but I have heard of cases of it within living memory. One was in the case of an uncle of mine who died about 35 years ago. On the morning of the funeral, my grandmother knelt down before the coffining at the side of the corpse. In a fairly loud sing-song chant with a definite air, she recited a good many verses about the deceased, his virtues and good qualities, his obedience to parents, diligence in work, musical and social abilities, etc. All was still while she was keening, and a good many of the bystanders were crying. Keening was a ritual lament for the dead. It was a form of extempore poetry in which the keeners would extol the virtues and describe the activities of the dead person, interspersed with standard phrases and exclamations. There are some suggestions that not all keens were complimentary. There was room for criticism of those who had lived and behaved badly. The keen had a tune and a rhythm. The Macroom keen was fairly loud sing-song chant with a definite air or tune. Some accounts noted how the sound would rise and fall as others joined into the chorus. The sound of the keen might travel over long distances. The performance of keening involved gestures as well as words. Keeners might wring their hands or throw them up in the air. They might kneel, take the hands of the deceased person or kiss them. Women often uncovered their hair and pulled at their hair. They might beat their breasts. While mostly associated with the Irish language and with women, there are also records of keening in English-speaking districts, and men also keened. It primarily involved the family members and friends of the deceased, and in some localities, particularly skilled keeners would be paid to amplify the sound and the visual effect. There were local conventions about when the keen might occur. For example, in many places there was a customary prohibition against any shows of sorrow in the first few hours after a death, for fear that this would impede the soul's passage into eternity. The Irish Folklore Archive preserves several accounts of keening, though by the time it was founded in the 1920s, the practice had already died out in many areas. And it died out for a few related reasons. There had long been criticisms of the keen. Some observers criticised what they saw as its fakeness. It was fake sorrow. Barnaby Rich in the 16 teens noted the existence of an expression, to weep Irish, meaning to weep at pleasure without cause or grief. Because some were paid to keen, for people like Rich, the whole custom was false and dishonest. Cultural and political factors also encouraged English commentators to view all kinds of Irish social customs as inferior or even barbarous. Historians who look at emotion in the past argue that expression of emotion is in large part culturally constructed and is shaped by the norms and values of particular societies at particular times. These ideas and values are subject to change. For example, for various reasons from the 16th century, people in the Irish and British Isles, especially men in the upper sections of society, were increasingly called upon to control their emotions when in public, and obviously the seemingly emotionally incontinent verbal and visual performance of the keen was at odds with such ideas. The main opposition, however, came from the Catholic Church, whose clergy increasingly were called upon to bring their congregations into line with new doctrines and new standards of personal behaviour. They were unhappy with various elements of Irish funeral rituals, such as wakes, which often became rowdy and potentially irreverent occasions, and which placed significant financial pressures on bereaved families. Keening was seen as disruptive as well, difficult for the clergy to control. There are even accounts of verbal battles between priests and keening women. Keening was also seen as spiritually suspect. It seemed to question God's will and to be at odds with Christian teaching that the good would meet one another again in heaven. Why would you lament the fate of those whose destination was so much better than this world? Instead, the clergy sought to redirect the activities of the living towards more pious projects, like prayer for those dead who lingered in purgatory. It may be that we need to see keening as a women's activity because women could capitalise on the constraints already on them to continue traditions like keening longer than men. In a strongly patriarchal society, women were believed to be less rational, less capable of controlling their emotions, and generally less continent than men, allowing a paradoxical kind of room for them to continue to express the grief and sometimes the protest of communities at times of loss and catastrophe.
I'm sorry for this grief, passing like vapour from me to you. In the sentence, she's no longer suffering. To what, to whom does she refer? What does that present tense mean? Barth asks in Morning Diary. How do we access the identity of the image when something about that identity is slipping? Nothing being lost immediately, no sudden blackness, but a slow fog, a vapour. I'm sorry for this grief passing like vapour from me to you. Where does the authority of image and identity coalesce in this frozen and fogged place? Where does the subject reside? In herself or in her image, her likeness? From yesterday or this morning, before she fell again and a new patch of bruise purpled her arm? Where is she going and when? Are you capturing what is left here or what is leaving this liminal space? Vapour is how she described the grief. It's how she described it passing from her to him. The intimacy of this vaporized grief is not something I know in fullness yet. I have watched from nearby and felt it on my skin, touched by its mist. I have felt it in the hot whiskies and cups of tea placed in front of me hourly, steam rising up to my chin. I have seen it in the condensation climbing the fogged kitchen window when he would cook a meal. I have seen it in the cigarette smoke, rising up behind the silhouette of Ronan's body that was always, always there. I have seen it in the incense smoke, enveloping the pile of warm night dresses that Dorje had taken off the radiator and folded. Later that evening he rearranged the order of one or two, and the folded size didn't seem to dictate it. I think he was subconsciously putting her favourite ones on top. Small, subconscious acts of minding. I'm sorry for this grief, passing like vapour from me to you. Being in the kitchen without her and not needing to give eye contact to Dee, only an audible prompt in his right and then left ear as he paced and spoke, I was able to look around the room. I could see her in it. The shelf of books behind where she sat last time filled my immediate gaze. There was a corkboard on the wall with all kinds of images, drawings and notes and postcards. The table had a blue PVC covered tablecloth with white polka dots, made to withstand his constant wiping. In the middle of the table, dried lavender, a lighter, a candle, and a photo of them both. On the shelf above the kitchen cupboards, just grazing the ceiling, my eye came across nothing, then a radiation mask, then nothing. I'm sorry for this grief, passing like vapour from me to you. Anaphora is a literary device, used to emphasize certain words or phrases by way of repetition. It can be used in coming to terms with an event by repeating and retaining it so that it cannot be forgotten, so that it can be transmuted into something else. Ocean Vuong is a Vietnamese writer. The week after his mother died, he stood in front of a packed auditorium to read, describing himself as clambering off the floor for the first time since the event, describing the audience as the hand helping him up. If he is on the floor and the audience is the hand, the art is the reason. That is what he is getting up to show us. That is what we are lifting him up to see. He approaches the microphone with what might seem like reluctance or nerves, but might just as well have been slow, fresh pain. When I am most useful to myself, he says, it is when I ask, what can I do in the aftermath? I am most useful to my work when I operate in the aftermath. After all this, I have to tend to my body. I have to feed myself. The aftermath of great anger and sadness is care. How do we work when we have to say, now what? Rather than words comes a thought of high windows, the sun comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. Anaphora. Sherry died. Sherry dies every time we talk about her dying, every time we look at a photo of her. And this is no bad thing. It is no worse than her dying once. Anaphora as a coping mechanism, Vuong writes in his poetry. Barth writing Morning Diary as a coping mechanism. De Burgh dreaming the end as a coping mechanism. The rest of us will attempt this at our turn outside of the clarity these three share. This cold light of clarity that knows that making art in conversation with our trauma will not and cannot hurt us further. Looking up and beyond Philip Larkin's high window will not hurt us further. Letting the fog pass between us. I'm sorry for this grief, passing like vapour from me to you.
Gleeson, the Events and Community Manager at Science Gallery Dublin, and today I'm interviewing the Grief Geek and author of Grief Demystified, Caroline Lloyd.
Hi Jane, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this event. I'm delighted to be here.
No problem, thanks so much for participating. Caroline, you're a bit of an expert on grief, having written the book and having 30 years experience researching and supporting those affected by anticipatory grief and the bereaved. How did you get into this field?
Briefly, because 30 years is a long time, I was bereaved when I was 22, and at that time there was no information. So I struggled a lot, and fast forward many years, and after many bereavements, including suicides and baby losses, my nephew died in 2005, and he was 3 and he died from cancer. And at that time, it was the same narrative, you know, you're going to get over it, you'll go through stages, and it just didn't resonate with me at all. So I was a senior finance professional at the time in London, and my way of dealing with everything is through education. So I just started reading everything I could get my hands on. I connected with a professor at one of the universities, and I just changed careers and started training in grief and bereavement and supporting people, and just became heavily involved in it that way.
Brilliant. So I'm sure you've come across so many different types and formats of grief as well, I guess. So I did kind of touch upon anticipatory grief in the last question, but when we were programming for this event, it's something that actually came up a lot and was part of, I guess, our plan in curating and programming the event itself, as a result of the impact of COVID-19. So how does the feeling of anticipatory grief compare to grief after experiencing a loss?
That's a great question. Anticipatory grief is uncertainty. So you're preparing for a death, you know it's going to happen, so you're dealing with losses as they occur leading up to the death, but you don't know when that's going to happen, you don't know what that's going to look like. And if you're looking at somebody with Alzheimer's, for example, you'll be losing parts of their character or personality along the way. So it's a progression, and it's incremental, and you're completely out of control. Whereas when somebody has died, whether it's anticipated or not, there's a certainty and a finality with death. So then it's a process, and you know what you're dealing with. You're dealing with the death of that person and all of the losses that result from that death.
I guess that's so interesting in regards to the way we're grieving at the minute as well, because we may or may not be grieving any specific loss, but we're also grieving things like our social life and our networks, our friends, our family, but also our past, presents and futures that we kind of expected for the summer months. And I guess with no actual tangible end in sight, it's very hard to kind of figure out where that could lead to.
So that's the uncertainty.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a huge part of our current moment, I guess. So Science of Grief has focused on a number of areas of grief. And one thing I've learned that we, Ireland as a nation, the way that we've grieved over time has dramatically changed. What do you think our attitude to grief is like in this country?
As a Welsh person, I started facilitating death cafes in Dublin in 2016. So I facilitated 10 now, and the last 2 with a co-facilitator, a wonderful senior social worker called Nisha. And when I started facilitating them, coming over from the UK, the first 3 were very similar in structure and content to what we would have in the UK. But the last, I'd say 6 or 7 have been very different. And the last 6 or 7 have all been bereaved people coming looking for validation. So when I talk to Irish people here, both within the death cafes, but also at college, at Trinity, where I'm doing my PhD, or when I talk to participants, when I talk to my friends over here, the general narrative in Dublin is that things are changing. It's becoming much more globalized, much more multinational. And so the traditional wake is either shrinking compared to how it used to occur, but it's also not happening in a lot of cases as well. So I heard of a friend of mine had 2 deaths before Christmas, sadly, both in December, and there was no wake. So she said it wasn't an issue for the friends or family because they were all prepared for it and they knew it wasn't going to happen for various reasons. But the neighbours who'd lived next door for 30, 40, 50 years really resented that there wasn't an opportunity for them to all come together as a community. So there's a lot of that. And with younger people, with children who are working full time and may not live near their relatives who've died, very difficult for them to juggle everything and negotiate. So I think the fast pace of life that we have now in Dublin, particularly near Dublin, I believe rural areas are different, and I can't comment on that because I don't live in a rural area, is that, you know, the same thing's happening here in Dublin that happens in cities everywhere, is that we're busy and our focus and our priorities our responsibilities, I should say, can lay elsewhere.
Definitely, yeah. And I guess with the prevalence of COVID-19, that's changing drastically as well, because we can't even grieve in ways that we used to, especially without that support network. How do you think this has impacted the process of grief?
We don't know yet. We won't know until afterwards what the fallout might look like, because this is unprecedented. So we have no research knowledge to tap into. What I can say is for people who aren't really involved in the academia side of things, is there's a narrative about disenfranchised grief where it's not socially recognized because we're living alone or isolated, but that is actually not what disenfranchised grief is. Disenfranchised grief is an empathic failure, and we don't have an empathic failure. Everyone knows what's going on. We're all doing our best and we're all supporting in whatever way we can, and will do when we come out of a lockdown. So that isn't what
Welcome to a Death Cafe. My name is Ruth McGill. I am a death doula in training. I am a singer, a singing educator, an actor, a mother, and your facilitator for the following 4 minutes or so of this espresso version of a Death Cafe. I say in training because my process, my work in my preparation to be a death doula is a lot of deep investigation of, in and around my own death. And one of those modes of investigation is talking, and what brings me to the Death Cafe. For anyone who may not know about the Death Cafe was born of many years of deep social and soulful activism by a man called John Underwood. He was looking for a way to enable us to have more conversations about death, and for that to be in a public space. So the cafe part, there are some rules. It's not for profit. No Death Cafe is for profit. It's accepting of all opinions. There's no agenda that's happening in a Death Cafe. It's very much what the group brings up. I think forgetting one more rule, but a very important one, is there must be a beverage and maybe a biscuit or a cake or something like that. So I don't know if you have that to hand. But yeah, and so he did such a good job bringing this to us. And unfortunately, John died in 2017. And his mother and his sister, and that's Susan Barsky-Reed and Jules Barsky, now have, you know, continued his wonderful work. And actually, he said in an interview that his thinking about death and his work about death didn't mean that death was this rosy bedfellow of his. In fact, he said death was a challenge for him. And it's that honesty and that with that naturalness that in a death cafe, it sort of yields this very rich conversation. It's full of there is no agenda, so you don't know what each death cafe is going to be about. It's about the people. In my position, I'm a facilitator. I'm holding the space for other people. The people who have come to past death cafes, some people like to be witnesses. They like to observe, to listen, and take in, and maybe not speak. And so valid. And there are people who maybe have recently experienced a death of a loved one, or maybe with someone who they had difficulty with. And so there's grief of many different kinds that's, you know, coming in, that's present. And there may be, and there have been people who are also dealing with, for the want of a better word, a terminal illness. And so those people are, everybody brings with them a richness from their own life and a generosity of spirit to share their stories. And it's a complete honor for me to ever hold a space like that. And it just makes me feel like I want more and more. And it is a social franchise. So if anyone out there wants to start one, you can basically start one. I usually start after giving the intro to Death Cafe. I usually invite people to speak about why they are, what brought them here. Tonight, since you are here for some reason for the science of grief, I'm wondering if I might like to, I would like to invite them maybe to share if you want, but don't feel like you have to, but maybe share, even if it's one word or a reasoning about why you are here in this space, in this virtual space. And, you know, that could be one word about your, maybe even how you feel in reaction to talking about death. So if that's something that you want to share, and you might see that there's a lot of people very similar to you writing similar things. And one thing I sort of wanted to leave with, since this is a very short, as I said, espresso version, is from his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and about grief, since this is the science of grief that we're all attending this evening or this afternoon. Francis Weller talked about gates within the great hall of grief, and even that image is quite a profound image, and I can see it. And he talks about these different gates. I'm just going to read them out. And so this might resonate with you. So these are the different gates. Everything I love, I will lose. The places that have not known love, the sorrows of the world, what I expected and did not receive, and ancestral grief. So those may also be, might be little things to nudge you into a way of thinking also about grief in its hugeness and vastness. Thank you so much for being here for my little 5 minute, maybe I went over the 5 minutes of a Death Cafe. It has been an honor to hold this virtual space for you, and I wish you well. Take good care. Bye.
Hi, my name is John O'Donovan, and this is an excerpt from a play I wrote called Flights. Flights tells the story of three men, Pa, Cusack, and Barry, and the annual party they host in remembrance of their friend Liam, who died when they were teenagers. This excerpt comes towards the end of the play when, tired from an evening's drinking, the three men reckon with the exact circumstances of Liam's final moments.
I used to be so jealous of you.
What?
First few years, apprenticing and after. Thought Aoife was gonna dump me. It was shit. Especially that first year. She was...
Hi, my name is John O'Donovan, and this is an excerpt from a play I wrote called Flights. Flights tells the story of three men, Pa, Cusack, and Barry, and the annual party they host in remembrance of their friend Liam, who died when they were teenagers. This excerpt comes towards the end of the play when, tired from an evening's drinking, the three men reckon with the exact circumstances of Liam's final moments.
I used to be so jealous of you.
What?
First few years, apprenticing and after. Thought Aoife was gonna dump me. It was shit. Especially that first year. She was... It was hard. And she'd come home and we'd go out and we'd see you. And yeah, I thought you were a waster not to be working.
Sound.
That was me. 18 on a 60-hour week. Texting her all night. Helping her through. Trying. I thought I had to stay awake every hour. Fucking pulling at everything every fucking minute just to keep it all together. And you, I thought, you didn't need anything.
Now what do you think?
Now I don't have time to think. Hasn't changed much. 16, 17 years. She's better usually. We added the kid. I think it's hard either way. And you get old either way. Hard to keep what you have. Hard to have none. Liam got away with it.
You think?
Definitely. 17. Got out of his peak. No recession.
He didn't get fat.
Or go bald.
You're the only one going bald.
Had that stupid fucking teenage love. Thought it meant everything. But cost nothing in the long run.
For Aoife.
For whoever. Fucking Santa Claus. Never found out it was nothing. No, nothing. But hard too. You think it was?
What?
What Barry said.
I don't think Barry knew him as well as you or me or Aoife.
No. That's not an answer either. Remember what Rin said?
Fuck Rin.
He said Liam was flat out in the middle of the road.
Lying to dodge jail just.
If he was making it up, wouldn't he say he ran out in front of him or just got clipped? Lying flat in the road.
Lying through his teeth. Aoife never comes.
Don't do that.
Is that why?
They were finished
Just a bone.
ages before. She told me. Anyway, we were kids. Who remembers all that stuff?
I do.
If he hadn't have died, would it bother us? It's childhood. You're supposed to forget the details. You can look back and pretend it was great.
It wasn't great.
And even if he was pissed off at Aoife and me, that's not our fault. That's a stupid reason. You don't just lie down and die because once you quite liked a girl.
So what? Forget it?
I know loads of people who've topped themselves since. Fellas on my course, nurses in with Aoife, developers, travellers. Apart from the hurling, it's the national fucking pastime. But we only remember Liam. What about them?
I didn't know them.
He did. But he couldn't give a shit, not really. It's the same thing every time. Family said they were happy. Friends all surprised. Everyone's happy till they're not. Whatever. I'm happy. I'm thirsty, but I'm happy.
People over there.
When?
Tonight. Time.
Amy.
Dave.
Mark.
Lisa.
Me.
Connor.
Me.
Shavy.
Staples.
Aoife.
Marita.
Me.
Spanso.
Shawnee.
Did anyone say Liam?
No.
Liam.
Liam wasn't here.
What?
You have to drink.
Of course he was. That's why we do this.
No, man, there was loads of us out playing darts that night, but not Liam.
What are you talking about?
He had his work thing, remember? The lads from the kitchen. Remember, we went into town to meet him, but there was no sign. We walked in groups of 2 all along the old main road, trying to hitch. It was me and Cusack, Annie and Spansel.
Yeah.
Me and Liam.
No, he was with the kitchen fellas. Your man the Mongans. A few others, maybe. We couldn't swing a lift.
We should have flashed the leg.
By the time we got into town, I was wrecked. Everyone went to Broderick's, but I was so pissed off from walking. I just wanted to head home. I was walking down the market past Gracie's. Remember Gracie's? It's where the bookies is now. And as I walked past, I saw Liam inside. He's off his face. I tried to get in, but dogs tried to eat me, so I shouted in. He didn't hit me. So, but I texted him, let him know where you were. That's the last time I saw him. It's bullshit. A nothing moment. But he wasn't with us.
And why do we do this?
We always did.
Just not that night.
We were. Not Toner, he was gone, he was leaving.
No, I thought he was with us.
No, man.
No? Fuck. I can't remember. I can't.
We should play.
I loved him.
Yeah.
No, but not even. I didn't even see him his last fucking day.
Yeah.
Why are we still here, man?
Because nowhere else is open.
Human 2. Stories of human connection in a sea of Rosie's dew. What exactly happens to a person's wants and needs when they are in a constant flow of pain? We all know that every human deserves a place to call home. A place to call your own is a basic need. However, as a society, we need to nourish the soul of those who have become acclimatized to their own pain. Beyond just bricks and mortar, how can we penetrate past 20 years of self-medication or the child abuse etched not only in their minds, but in the very fibre of their being, if we don't try to do so? After having spent half my life as a community worker and working with people on the fringes of society, I've learned that to help them, you have to step into their space with them, engage with them face to face as human beings and connect. The residents of the homeless accommodation in which I worked had all experienced pain. Love, caring about being wanted or being attractive, falling down the list of needs, and survival taking top spot. As someone in a position of authority, I constantly thought about how to maintain that authority and keep boundaries with the residents I worked with, while also being able to judge a situation. That being said, there were rare moments when I was able to connect with them in a way that I'll never forget. I want to tell the stories of a number of beautiful interactions with some amazing men that allowed me into their hearts and allowed me to exist there alongside their trauma. It may have only been momentarily, but they happened and they have stuck with me to this day. To love and to hold. Love is a burning thing, and it makes a fiery ring. Bound by wild desire, I fell into a ring of fire. Is this music all right, Jim? I know you don't like to be touched. Are you okay with me holding you? Do you think there is a heaven? Are you afraid of dying? You know we all love you and we'll miss you dearly. It's okay, I have you. I'm not going anywhere. Goodbye. Apart from singing Charlie Lansbury and Johnny Cash, the preceding sentences are all things I said to Jim as I held him in his final hours. His answers to my questions were all he said on that last night before his life ended. Jim was a long-time resident of the hostel accommodation, and even though you had to be quick to duck when he swung his fist, he was popular and well-liked. Jim was an alcoholic in his 70s and refused point-blank to see a doctor, no matter how ill he was. Fuck off was the only response to me or anyone else that tried to convince him to do anything that he did not want to. I would usually retort with the same back to him, which would cause him to look up with the tiniest hint of a smirk. He seemed to respect me putting it up to him. Something I learned quickly about Jim was that he did not like to be touched. He wasn't a huge communicator, so he never shared why this was, not with me anyway. There could be any number of reasons for it, but it always appeared to be a defence. Maybe years of self-protection on the streets taught him to get his fists up quick. On many occasions, I forgot the do not touch rule. I did sometimes choose to ignore it if it was to catch him from falling. It was never received well. However, this was not the case during the last 6 hours of his life. I sat with Jim all night and felt honoured that in these last moments he agreed to accept human contact. With every exhale, it felt as if his pain was leaving his soul. With every strained breath, he held my hand a little tighter. He even said no to playing U2 and smiled to Johnny Cash. He was not afraid to die and believed in God. Death can often be sad, scary, but Jim had lived until his 70s, even after years of alcohol abuse and trauma. I think this is a testament to the incredible work and staff of the services that cater to long-term homeless, who would otherwise, in their absence, simply be street drinkers. In those last moments, it was just me, Jim, and Johnny Cash's ring of fire. It was beautiful. The pain left his face, and for the first time in a long time, he was held with love and care by another human. To be wanted and to feel attractive. The desire to be wanted or to feel attractive can often be rejected as weakness or of lesser intrinsic value than love. Based on my experience, I disagree. Managing working relationships was often a difficult tightrope to walk as a young woman working in the homeless services. This is especially true when working with men of a similar age that in any other situation could have been in your circle of peers. They often passed remarks on how I looked or jokingly suggested a date. It's never really a joke though. Even though they know it's never going to happen, the human being behind the bravado wants to feel that you might also be attracted to them. It is certainly true that boundaries are crucial in situations like that, but you also need to remain aware that the person you are there to support and to advocate for is vulnerable. Ensuring that you don't make them feel rejected, while also being clear that a line exists that they cannot cross, was difficult. Sometimes in extremely challenging situations, I felt it was necessary to shift the boundary line. With Noel, it was necessary. Lynn, do you like my new tracksuit and my new Liverpool jersey? Noel would often go looking for a compliment on his appearance. He was in his 30s, he was a non-smoker, but he was a chronic alcoholic. His investments in new tracksuits gradually became more and more regular, in a desperate bid to divert from the mustard colour of his skin. We were watching him die in front of us. This young man, who acted like a teenager most days, seemingly just wanted a matriarchal figure to mind him. Noel would refuse treatment time and time again, eventually choosing death by Budweiser over losing his bed in the homeless system. Noel died because the system failed to ensure he would not be discharged back into safe accommodation. He died because he never wanted to sleep on the street again, and liver disease seemed like a lesser of two evils. Before his death, he became too ill to stay in the hostel and was transferred to St. James's Hospital. As I slowly entered Noel's hospital room, I prepared myself mentally for the image that awaited me. He was sleeping, he was frail, and he was dying. He would not leave the hospital again, and he would die a week later. I sat quietly at his bedside as he slept and rehearsed my facial expressions for when he woke, so he would never know how frightened I was by the fact that he didn't look like himself anymore. If it weren't for his name on his chart at the end of the bed, I wouldn't have even known it was him. Finally, he opened his eyes and welcomed me with a big smile, as big as I'd ever seen. We chatted for a while about life and death and what could have been. But as I reluctantly got up to leave, he grabbed me by the wrist. I could tell he knew this would be our last conversation. He said he didn't want to die, so I turned around to face him again. He told me that he had always fancied me, and if he wasn't dying homeless or an alcoholic, that I would fancy him too. He said that in another life that I would have gone out with him. He reminded me of a young boy, vulnerable and unsure of himself. So without any hesitation, I knew bending the truth didn't matter anymore. I told him, "Sure, why do you think I'm here? I've always fancied you too." I kissed him on the forehead and gave his hand a squeeze. He smiled, said thanks, and I left. Wanting to be wanted, wanting to feel attractive, and wanting to know that you are desirable is something that I always pretend not to care about. But my final experience with Noel brought it back to basics. He taught me to embrace the vulnerability that is wanting someone to make you feel okay about who you are. He reminded me of the teenage innocence of fancying someone, with no motivation or expectation behind it. Just one human saying, "I like you," and having that reciprocated. I will remember him in his polite, loving manner forever.
Hi, my name is Ryan Vale. I'm part of a project called Borders, which comprises of 2 artists, Elma Orchestra and myself. We're both live in chat tonight, so you can ask us anything. We're delighted to be part of this festival, and I will hand you over to Elma Orchestra now to explain more about the project. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Owen O'Callaghan, otherwise known as Elma Orchestra. I'm a producer, composer, songwriter, based in Derry in Northern Ireland, and over the last year I've been collaborating with a fellow Derry producer called Ryan Vale. The result was an album called Borders. It went on to win the NI Music Prize, and we've toured it all over the world. We've been in Mexico, we've been in Germany, we've been in France. We're supposed to be in Canada, but due to this coronavirus lockdown, we're not. The album Borders was basically inspired initially by Brexit that was happening on our doorstep. We live right on the border here between north and south, and to us it's an invisible line. We see sheep and animals just crossing that line in the field right outside the studio window. And I've been flying drones for years, and I can see when you fly over the border line it's invisible. Basically nature completely ignores it, and that was quite a lot of what inspired the album. It became almost soundtracking the border. The show became a very visual experience along with the music, and had a lot of drone footage, and it was always focused on the beauty of the land that we share. And we've been given this opportunity with Dublin Science Museum to share some of our work, so we're going to show the newest single, which is called Love. It's the final single of the project, and it basically just encapsulates the whole feeling of the sense of what the project is really about. It's compromise, it's, I suppose, caring about our fellow human race and realising that we're only ever as strong as our weakest member. So I hope you enjoy it, and please get in touch with us on any of the socials. So I'm Elma Orchestra with Ryan Vale, and the album is called Borders, and this is the single called Love.
respect, love, respect, love, things are changing so rapidly, and there's so much still that's unknown that we don't know what the situation is going to be 2 weeks from now. We don't know what the situation is going to be 1 week from now.
Some individuals are symptomatic and others are not. And so it has had a bit of a fear of the unknown that has been complicated by how quickly it has moved really around the world, and certainly within the United States and within the Atlanta area. So that has been unsettling for all of us.
Welcome to Science Gallery Atlanta. My name is Dr. Deborah Watkins-Brunner, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Research at Emory University. In the next hour, you will hear from Emory University's faculty, staff, and healthcare providers who are working on various dimensions of grief in these extraordinary times. Through their research to find a cure, their selfless care for those with this virulent coronavirus, or through their art that gives voice to grief. Welcome to Science Gallery Atlanta.
I'm Kevin Carnes, Professor of Music and Vice Provost for the Arts at Emory University. Our first guest in Emory's segment of this program is a veteran of infectious disease research. Dr. Anish Mehta was part of the Emory team that successfully treated patients with Ebola virus disease some years ago. Hello, Anish, and thank you for speaking with us. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
My name is Anish Mehta. I'm an infectious disease physician at Emory University Hospital. I'm also a member of the Emory Serious Communicable Diseases team. And I am the lead investigator for Emory University for the NIH Adaptive COVID Trials of Therapeutics, which has recently completed a comparison of remdesivir versus placebo for the care of COVID-19 patients.
In terms of what we know and what we don't know, and there's a lot that we don't know, what do you think are the key gaps in knowledge right now, especially around transmission and treatment?
I think transmission is a really key focus for us to understand. We really need to know where transmission is occurring, in what context, what settings, and importantly, how much of asymptomatic or patient or people with very mild symptoms, how much are they spreading compared to others? And I think our knowledge is growing greatly in the transmission dynamics, the context in which spread occurs, but I think we still have a long way to go. And unfortunately, we would usually use things like contact tracing and some of these classic epidemiologic techniques to find this information out. But the outbreak spread so rapidly and sort of overwhelmed some of our ability to collect these data. And so I think we're still catching up from that process to really understand transmission. And the other areas that I think are key for our research to contribute to are really, how do we take care of these patients, and are there any therapies, any medicines, or what we call medical countermeasures that may impact their care?
One of the observations of COVID-19 patients by clinicians is the seemingly sudden collapse of a patient who until then shows no sign of being critical. Have you seen that? And what are some of the theories around why that's happening?
One of the things is just the dramatic amount of inflammation that is induced by this infection in certain people. And we can see that infection sort of overwhelm the body and really cause tissue damage and other side effects from just the dramatic inflammation. We've also found that this virus, probably due to the inflammation that it induces, is causing clots, blood clots in people. And sometimes they're small clots, sometimes they're large clots. But I can think of very specific instances where patients were seemingly stable, but developed a massive blood clot that went to their lungs, and suddenly the patient was dramatically ill and had to be on a ventilator, and some of these patients died. And so it is quite shocking when you see that. And I think as we learn more, hopefully we'll have better ways of predicting it. But now we have, because we understand that some of these reasons, we're really trying to address that inflammation, and we're trying to address clotting of the blood so that we prevent some of these more dramatic outcomes.
Since we're in the midst of it, it's hard to sometimes take a step back and see the good. What do you think is the silver lining in this? And what are some of the lessons learned?
It's just the way that the global community, particularly the healthcare community, came together and started to spread information, collaborate together to understand what was going on with patients and how we could help patients and we could help our community. I think that has just been heartwarming to be part of. And I think for me as an individual clinician, the great silver lining is that while there are patients who are sick, and unfortunately a few that pass away, which is obviously quite dramatic and sad, we have so many patients going home, and now I get to see them back in clinic and get to see that they're getting to be with their children or their grandchildren now. They're walking. A few of them just went back to work this week, and they're back to the lives that they want to live. And I think that is just a wonderful thing to be part of, knowing that all the work that we have all been doing together is really contributing to getting people back home and getting them back to the life they want to live.
We've heard several stories from so many frontline healthcare providers on this pandemic. Having dealt with Ebola especially, which was a huge milestone in terms of emerging infectious diseases and care, what do you think has been the most challenging aspect for you?
So starting with professionally, we are seeing these patients every day, and usually we have a very collaborative relationship with the patient and their family. But in this setting, the patients are isolated from their family. And that's quite tough to watch your patient not being able to be there with their loved ones, because you really want that support to be part of their medical care. And we do have technologies that allow them to talk to them, but it's not quite the same as having your spouse or your parent or your child in the room with you to give you that support. And that's hard to watch for our patients, for sure. And clearly the patients that we've lost are quite difficult. I think we do have patients that pass away from infectious disease, but usually we know what we're treating, and we have things to treat them with, along with the great clinical care. And we have not seen this amount of mortality in a communicable disease in a while.
Would you feel comfortable sharing a story that in your mind illuminates the science of grief from a healthcare perspective?
There was one case that I think has really sort of affected me. And it is in a, sort of a heartbreaking yet beautiful way. So there was a patient, and this is, an elderly gentleman, but very high functioning, runs a business, very intelligent. And we talked about the study, wanted to think about it. He talked it over with his granddaughter, and I talked it over with his granddaughter. And, we all came together and decided finally that this was the right study for him, and he agreed to be in it. And so we gave him one dose of the medicine, and then he did fine. And then suddenly the next day he got very ill very quickly. And again, quickly transferred to the ICU. And unfortunately, even before we can give him the second dose of the medicine, he had a cardiac arrest. And the ICU team fought valiantly for him for hours to try to revive him, bring his heart back. But it became very clear that he was not going to survive. And so he has this wonderful granddaughter who has been his medical caretaker. And so she very well understood what was going to happen. And he had this wonderful nurse, Alex, who stayed in the room with him to keep him comfortable during the dying process, but also had his cell phone, the patient's cell phone, charged, and so his granddaughter could talk to him. We witnessed, all of us, this wonderful granddaughter talking to her grandfather as he was dying, and just saying wonderful things to him, telling him stories about their life together. And again, it was beautiful yet heartbreaking. It just shows that what we do scientifically and medically has a dramatic impact, but also what we do in our communities and the family that we live with and the family that cares for us is so much more important. And while she couldn't be in the room, we found a way for her to be able to talk to him during that process. And that was really meaningful. That just little bit of being able to hold that cell phone and his nurse just staying there for all that time, just holding that cell phone to his ear so his granddaughter could talk to him was really meaningful and will stick with me for a long time.
Hi, my name is Naomi Newton. I'm a fourth-year medical student at Emory School of Medicine, about to graduate in a little less than a week. I'll be doing emergency medicine residency. I'll be starting my first year of residency at the University of Miami Jackson Memorial Hospital. Super excited about that. So I'll be heading to Miami, Florida in a couple weeks. So a little bit of background as to why I wrote this poem. It was actually an assignment for a literature and medicine class that I took back in March. And towards the end of the class, as we were getting ready to kind of wrap up our final papers and submit everything, our professor asked us if, in addition to our final paper, if we could just write a short reflection on the COVID-19 outbreak, since that was something that we were all kind of living through and adjusting to at that moment. So this poem was born out of that. I do love to write. That's something that I've always enjoyed doing, even as a kid. So whether it's poetry, essays, short stories, plays, all of that, words have always been very important to me. I love to read, I love to write. I just think that words have a lot of power and a lot of magic in them. Also, as someone who's going into emergency medicine, that's a field that's very much built on service and advocacy, and I picked it because I wanted to work on the front lines of healthcare. So for me, it's kind of like, I wish I could be there to help, but then also realizing that I am very much in my early stages of medical training. So then there's the question of how much help would I really be? Would I, even if I could be in the hospital right now, would I be more in the way? And then thinking about going into residency, which is going to start in a couple months, that imposter syndrome too, that idea of, okay, well now here's my chance to step up and serve, but am I equipped for the task? Am I ready? Will I be in the way instead of being useful when I'm actually there trying to help? So I think all of those feelings kind of ended up in this poem. And for me, I think art really informs medicine. I think that the ability to process your emotions makes you more empathetic, and it makes you more ethical too, right? A lot of the feelings I described weren't necessarily feelings that I'm proud of, but they were feelings that I had to work through. And I think it's important to acknowledge all of those feelings, because if you don't acknowledge them, then you just kind of repress them, and then that eats away at you and is counterproductive. But I concluded with this idea that to be human is to suffer. It's to experience all of these feelings, good and bad, to have, lived through something like a pandemic. That is part of what it means to be human, but to be human is also to create. And I think holding on to that will help us heal as we work through this challenging new experience together. So now I'd like to share this poem with you. The poem is entitled Hubris. Hubris. I'm on the cusp of something so important, yet I'm relegated to the sidelines. Medical students were banned from hospital rotations, although the school held out until the very end. Students are like dutiful postal workers. For neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. We always show up at the hospital. That is, until they run out of PPE. And remember that we're non-essential workers who are always in the way, yet trying ever so hard to be useful. I know it's not about me, and I'm all too happy to surrender a mask to a clinician or staff member who needs it to do their hero's work. I don't care about missed match days and doctoral hooding ceremonies. How could I, when so many are suffering? In fact, I'm proud of the ways that my classmates have banded together to do our duty remotely and provide hope and relief to our wearied leaders. But a small part of me, the part that can't wait to shove my short white coat into the back of my closet and embrace the title of emergency room doctor in early June, wishes that I, too, could answer the call to arms and join my colleagues in this worldwide virologic battle. At the moment, I feel useless and far removed as I zoom into classes and scroll through viewing options on Netflix. Totally isolated from the war zone that's not 5 miles from my apartment.
Healthcare providers are on the front lines of this crisis, caring for others with COVID in a time of great uncertainty. We have one of those heroes with us today, registered nurse Josiah Mamora. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Josiah Mamora. I'm a nurse clinician here at Emory Healthcare. I'm also one of the lead nurses for the Serious Communicable Disease Unit, otherwise known as the Ebola Unit.
You have been on the front lines of two of the most deadly viruses of our generation, both Ebola and COVID. Can you compare and contrast? How is COVID different?
COVID's different in that it's an actual global pandemic. Ebola was more of like a regional pandemic. There were multiple countries, a lot of patients, but it was pretty much sequestered into a small region of the globe. It's still a large region landmass-wise, but specifically sequestered in just one continent. And then we had our small hospital outbreak here of two patients who were healthcare workers in the States. But most of our patients were repatriated folks from West Africa, or workers, healthcare workers from West Africa. COVID is more of a global pandemic in that where you get COVID and how you've gotten COVID in an epidemiological sense, it's hard to ascertain at this point. We all know it's from, the origination is from Wuhan, China, but as for healthcare workers here, if they get it, where did they get it from? The patient, the community.
So, Josiah, in the middle of all that you've been dealing with,
probably violating my hour restrictions, but it's like you just have this obligation. Again, I have an internal obligation to do as much as I can, but also not and as well for my coworkers who have out of the PPE training and everything else. When they have questions, I try to answer those questions immediately so that they feel, my coworkers, my colleagues, they feel supported. And honestly, I don't have a good way, or I don't have a good method to say, like how to cope. The only way I do cope with the fatigue is I exercise. Especially with COVID, it's hard to leave work at work because you're just inundated by COVID on media. Even when you come home, there's you're worried about COVID, and we're at work, it's COVID. It's just COVID everywhere, and it's very fatiguing. So I think just cutting out time for yourself to just check out of the news cycle and out of your work regimen, at least for a little bit of time. Hopefully everyone realizes how interlinked everyone else's occupations and lives are. And I think hopefully we'll all have like a bigger community, like a more, not so much as like a national community, but like a global community, or global sense that like, hey, we're all linked together, and we really are all just like separated by 6 degrees, if not less. I mean, it used to be 6 degrees of, separation, or, there was another term, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. How many people, are separated from you and Kevin Bacon? But I think with COVID, it's like, we've all been touched by COVID, either by the disease or by the economic factors, or even by the life changes that we've had to make. And I think hopefully at the end of this, we realize that we're all connected, and that we can all kind of move together as a single entity, like a single humanity, a single species, and a single kind of understanding that we really are all in this together. And that's ironically Emory Healthcare's mantra, that we're all in this together.
Well, there could not be better closing words, Josiah. We are so thankful for your service, and please stay safe.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Dr. Nadine Kaslow is professor and vice chair of psychology and behavior services at Emory University School of Medicine. Nadine is the chief psychologist of Grady Health System and a former president of the American Psychological Association. A few weeks ago, Nadine joined Emory audiences on Facebook Live to answer questions about how to stay focused and positive during the pandemic. Nadine, you're helping provide mental health care to our frontline healthcare workers, and you're also an expert on how mass events impact all of us. Can you share with us the reality from some of the briefings that you've had with our healthcare workers?
Sure. So I've been spending a lot of time with colleagues doing debriefings with groups of people, nurses, techs, physicians, respiratory therapists, and the like, who are really on the front lines right now, and providing an opportunity for them to talk about how they're feeling, how they're doing, what they're concerned about, their stresses, both at work and at home, talking about some effective ways to sort of bolster their resilience during this time, some tips for coping, and really helping people reflect on what they're grateful about right now and having gratitude about. People are incredibly stressed out. They are worried about getting COVID-19 themselves, getting infected themselves, infecting other people, their families. It's very sad and difficult to see how ill patients are, how sick people are, people dying from the virus. There's not enough protective equipment to go around, which everybody's been hearing about. Everyone's grateful to the community for all the ways they've stepped up for healthcare workers, and that's one of the things people are most grateful for. But people are scared, and they're panicking, and they're angry at sort of systems not able to take care of them as much as they need to be taken care of. and they're tired. Some people are separated from their families right now because they want to be sure their family is safe or their family's not comfortable with them, and that's added stress as well.
What can families of healthcare workers and the rest of us in general do to show support to those workers?
Well, I think people have done a tremendous job of offering resources. So many healthcare workers have talked about things like neighbors or their religious community, leaving them food, writing them thank you notes, sending them texts to check in, expressing gratitude. I know in some places at a certain time of the day, everybody's going outside and thanking the healthcare workers. And that means a lot to people, providing protective equipment to people and masks and things like that really helps. But I think that what many healthcare workers really need people to do is listen to them, is listen to their stress, listen to their strain, be supportive to them, be compassionate and kind toward them, and thank them, but also listen to them as they talk about their struggles.
A lot of people are stress eating and drinking right now. How can we manage our stress? Can we actually use our diet for good to manage the stress?
So I'm glad you raised the issue about drinking, because that's absolutely alcohol and drug misuse. Again, in the extreme would be other indicators that people are really struggling and may need to seek help. Whereas some people are doing things like having virtual happy hours and enjoying those, and maybe doing that a little more regularly than normal. That to me seems like a reasonable way to cope. Same thing with the eating. Again, a little bit of stress eating, that's within the normal range right now. If somebody starts gaining 20, 30 plus pounds through this, that would really worry me. But if a lot of people gain, a few pounds, I think that's quite understandable. But to me, sometimes stress eating is comforting. I don't think this is the time to really try to limit yourself too much unless it's really out of control. But I do think that it needs to be balanced with exercise.
How do I deal with feeling helpless and powerless right now?
So feeling helpless and powerless is, again, just like the anxiety, very understandable reaction. I think what's useful to do is differentiate what you can control and how you can control that, and do everything that you can, and then what you can't control, and us all get to a place, of being more accepting of that. And so I think that when you feel helpless, sort of stop and say, what is there that I can control? What am I doing to maximize my coping and problem solving related to that? And then what is it that I simply, unfortunately, cannot control? And how do I come to some kind of peace with that, some acceptance, and also sort of ponder larger, more existential questions related to that when you don't feel in control.
Nadine, thank you for covering so many topics and areas of concern for us. If you or someone you know is in need of emotional support at this time, here are some contacts for people who can help. Please reach out.
Hi, I'm Heather Crystal. I'm an assistant professor of creative writing at Emory University, and I'm going to be reading from my latest book, which is called The Crying Book. It's my first work of nonfiction. I'm usually a poet, and it came about after many, many years of researching crying. There's a lot of quoted material in the book, words from other people's minds and pages, so when I'm reading those moments, I'll just indicate that by lifting my hand, and you'll know that I am quoting something else. I also mention many of my friends in this book who are poets and artists and writers, and I call them by their first names, which I do in real life, so don't worry about not knowing who they are. Crying won't make you feel better. We only think that it will, or perhaps more important, think that at some point in the past it did. Let it out, we hear some imaginary figure instruct, and tearfully we obey. But when subjects report their mood immediately after a crying episode, it's often worse than before. Then again, this may be because the subjects are crying in a laboratory. The tears are meant to solicit aid, and the researchers provide little comfort to those whose tears they've provoked. Rachel disagrees, says crying for her provides a great release. She also says the half moon looks like a taco, which makes me trust her capacity for both truth and joy. It's June, and Chris and I are supposed to go teach at a writers' institute in Massachusetts, but the baby, now a full year old, has a terrible ear infection, and I have to stay home with her in Ohio. Chris goes alone. I cry at the loss of precious time with dear friends, at the chance to be someone and something other than mother. Chris is supposed to give a reading with Jim, our old teacher, our beloved poet, husband to Dara, a parent to Emily and Guy. Chris comes home. Jim dies. I turn, as one does, to his poems. You cannot weep. I cannot do anything that once held an ounce of meaning for us. I cover you with pine needles. When morning comes, I will build a cathedral around our bodies, and the crickets, who sing with their knees, will come there in the night to be sad, when they can sing no more. Emily and I exchange techniques to stop crying. There comes a time, we say, when one is simply not in the mood. Pick a color, she tells me, and find every instance of it in the room. I pick blue. I pick dark green. One day, I call her and say that if I start to cry, I want her to squawk like a chicken. When my voice starts to shake, she panics and quacks like a duck. Then I am laughing and crying all at once, wet and loud and thankful, and it feels as if my heart has turned itself inside out. There are other ways to stop. One day, reading Joan Didion, I learn a new method. It was once suggested to me that, as an antidote to crying, I put my head in a paper bag. As it happens, there is a sound physiological reason, something to do with oxygen, for doing exactly that, but the psychological effect alone is incalculable. It is difficult, in the extreme, to continue fancying oneself Kathy in Wuthering Heights with one's head in a food fair bag. Among WikiHow's How to Stop Yourself from Crying, my favorite step is remove the lump from your throat. A surgery by active will. I imagine it falling into my hand like a doll's pacifier. If you cannot stop your tears, or if you must take your cried-out face into public, you can hide behind a lie about allergies or a cold. You could, like Roland Barthes, don dark sunglasses. The intention of this gesture is a calculated one. I want to keep the moral advantage of stoicism, of dignity, and at the same time, contradictorily, I want to provoke the tender question, but what's the matter with you? I fear the tender question, whose ever-elusive answer will only stimulate more tears. The hiding is a way to stop other people from trying to help, a way to not have to explain precisely how and why I cannot be helped. I'd like to hang a little sign on each lens, out of order. When Gabrielle sends me a passage from Michelle T's novel Black Wave, she is trying to help me with my writing, not with my crying, but I find ideas in it to try out in my own life. She kept tablespoons in the freezer, would place their rounded bottoms on her eyelids. She kept chamomile tea bags soaking in the fridge. She kept cucumbers handy and would layer her face in slices. At a beauty store, she selected a product with raspberry extract that promised to reduce eye puffiness. In the novel, Michelle does not find the people's suggestion to use preparation H on puffy eyes useful, but I buy some anyway. The ointment form is too greasy, but the cream seems to help. I love the way people offer these remedies to one another, the care of tending, the way they try to offer an answer to a problem without lobbying a query of their own. People want to know, can the phoenix's tears bring someone back to life? They go to Yahoo Answers, and everyone weighs in. No, they can only heal wounds. They would not even heal a dead person's wounds, for the tears only make the skin heal faster, and dead skin does not heal, and even if it did heal, the tears cannot bring them back to life by shocking their heart back into motion. Reading this is like riding a water slide of tears. I go down it again and again. There is no phoenix, and no phoenix tears, and nothing can bring back the dead, but these words, these hopes, and these breathless responses, they can shock a heart back into motion. I have felt it, have felt myself alive.
I am Dr. Evan Anderson, Associate Professor of Pediatrics and Medicine at Emory University. I'm the principal investigator at Emory University of the mRNA vaccine that is being developed for COVID-19 response.
One of the things I've heard is that there's been a huge response in terms of people calling and wanting to be on the trial. Is that unusual? What does that tell you about the hunger for this?
We have had a very significant response with a lot of people expressing interest and potentially volunteering for the study. The initial screening visit is usually an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours in length, and very critical as far as trying to make sure that we're really identifying people who are otherwise very healthy without a lot of other medical comorbidities, which might complicate our assessment of the safety and the immune response to the vaccine.
In the age group, is anyone over 18?
Yeah, so the study initially started as being 18 to 55, but then has been expanded up with no upper limit from the age standpoint. And so it's enrolling all adults now.
How optimistic can we be about this vaccine?
We all want to quickly develop a vaccine and to have one available so that we can move back towards our old normal situation in which we're walking around without masks and going to work and interacting with our families and our friends without fear. Obviously, we'd like to get back to that point again. The simple reality is that most vaccines that start out in phase 1 clinical trials do not make it all the way to vaccine licensure. In fact, it's the minority of vaccines that do make it. Certainly, we're cautiously optimistic about this vaccine. So far, as Tony Fauci has said, there are no red flags associated with the vaccine to date, although the safety continues to be monitored. And hopefully we'll be able to move on to the phase 2 study over the next months.
How many phases are there typically in a vaccine trial?
So there are typically 3 phases to vaccine development, similar to drug development. So we are in phase 1. There's a larger phase 2 study that then would be conducted, typically enrolling hundreds of people. And then ultimately the key study will be the phase 3 study or phase 3 studies that need to be done that look at the actual ability of the vaccine to prevent COVID-19 disease, and as well ensuring safety in a large number of individuals, typically in the thousands, is required for the phase 3 studies. So we have a ways to go towards getting the vaccine license, but everyone is doing all that they can to expedite the process as much as we safely can.
You've probably met some of the enrollees in this vaccine's trial. Tell us a little bit about what their thoughts are and what they're telling you in terms of hope, despair, and aspiration.
Everyone wants to be involved with helping in some form or fashion. I think it's an important human characteristic that we have. So you have people making masks at home. You have people making signs for healthcare workers. You have the healthcare workers that are going in and taking risk upon themselves to try and benefit their fellow man on a daily basis. Part of my job right now is trying to move forward this vaccine as quickly as we safely can. And that's my specific role. Many of the vaccinees are actually thrilled to have the opportunity to contribute to the effort to respond to COVID-19. And there may or may not be any benefit. There's even theoretical harm associated with the vaccine, but they want to do something to help with the COVID-19 response. And so in many ways, they're really heroes and very admirable people that are willing to take some unspecified risk upon themselves to try and benefit the whole of the society. And so we're very, very fortunate for the volunteers that we have had in the past and the ones that we currently have.
Our next healthcare hero is a registered nurse, Letha Love. Letha, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you work and where you are now?
My name is Letha Love, like you stated. I work at Emory Healthcare at Winship C, and that's the Cancer Institute at the main campus. Right now I'm in Manhattan, New York, with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Letha, you made an incredible sacrifice. You asked a family member to take care of your children so that you could go from Atlanta to the epicenter, New York. What compelled you to do that?
The decision was based on prayer and if I needed to be up here or at home. Being at home, I know there's a chance of me exposing my kids. So I decided to come here, and I can't expose them from here.
Are you with a group of nurses that have come from other places and they're giving you lodging?
Oh yes, definitely. It's over 1,000 nurses. And
I can't
PAs.
imagine how close you've become. You've made new bonds that are, even for nurses, stronger and more amazing than what we usually face in work. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course, you have to make bonds with people up here. You don't have any family here. It's so emotional up here. You have to have some shoulder to cry on. If not, you would lose it. You would definitely not make it in this environment if you didn't make bonds with people that you don't know. Just so happened, I came up with a friend of mine that I've been friends with for over 7 years, but she and I are on different shifts, so I never get to see her. The ladies that I've met in the employee health, it has been kind of my rock right now, because they definitely listen to each other in the struggle of what we're going through, because none of us want to get sick.
You know, and speaking of that struggle, as a former ICU nurse, I know that you are used to critically ill, dying patients. What is different about this, Letha?
The difference is when we are in ICU on a regular basis, it's just ICU, you have your 2 patients, they may be critical, but the probability of them dying so all of a sudden, or you coming to work the next night, you would have those same 2 patients. Up here in the ICU,
Take a moment, Letha. Take all the time you need.
Yeah. Up here, you might have the same patients, not 1 day or 2 days, and then they're gone. I've never been in a hospital, and I've also worked at Grady, and I know you know how Grady is. I've never heard so many codes in one night. 7 or 8 different codes, and not only just ICU, all over the hospital, in the ER, on med-surg. I mean, just codes all night, every 30 minutes almost. I just never experienced that, and it's beyond what you would ever experience as a nurse.
So how are you coping with that? What is it you do to get through this, Letha?
I pray. I talk to my friend. I call my kids. And I rely on people praying for me and giving me support just to make it through the next day, honestly.
It's good to know that there are ways for you to cope with this grief. But is there anything you would like to say to those watching? How can we help?
Right now, we just need support. If any nurses want to come up here and help out, or PAs, or MPs or what have you, the space is still here. As far as a community, I think the biggest thing for help would be to please stay at home, because I'm gonna have to leave New York and come home to the same thing. And that's a lot. That's a lot. It's a lot to know that I may have to leave New York and come work in Georgia under the same environment. And it's a lot, just because now that weighs on my mind. And that's my question to people. Is your appearance more important than your life?
Letha, we're very grateful for your time. Our thoughts and our prayers are with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
One of Emory University's premier infectious disease experts, Dr. Carlos Del Rio, joined an Emory-hosted Facebook Live gathering a couple weeks ago to provide an update on the clinical and public health impact of the new coronavirus. Carlos, what are some factors for higher mortality rates in our community?
We're looking at that. We're studying that. I think several possibilities. Number one is health disparities. Number two is higher prevalence of diabetes and hypertension. Remember, we're in the diabetes belt, right? A lot of diabetes in our population. So diabetes, hypertension, obesity may be more prevalent, which drives mortality. So again, this is the sort of the clashing of diabetes, hypertension with an infectious disease is being lived right now in our community.
How does wearing masks help slow the spread?
One of the things we've learned, and we're pretty certain now, is not only that there's asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission. We now know from a recent study that about 2 to 3 days before you develop symptoms, you're highly infectious. And in fact, some of the studies suggest that maybe up to 40 to 50% of transmissions occur during those 2 days before you develop symptoms. So you may be sitting here and feeling fine, but you're already transmitting. So the idea of having people wear a mask is so if you happen to be in that stage, by wearing a mask, you then don't transmit to others because your saliva and your secretions stay within the mask and they're not then shared with others. So by doing that, we can probably decrease asymptomatic transmission a significant amount. Now, the one important thing is that then you have to wash this mask because obviously the inside is going to be contaminated if you cough or you sneeze into it. And I would suggest that you treat this mask with a lot of care so you don't infect others in your household.
Do we ever go back to where we were?
We may need to wear a mask for a long period of time. We may need to see who's infected and who hasn't. We may need to think about, there may be antivirals being developed in the meantime. So we may go back to a normal in which you're diagnosed and you start an antiviral right away. So I think things will change. I don't think we're going to be in this position until 2022, like the study suggests. But clearly, we're not going to be back to where we were only a few months ago. I think it's going to take some time to get there. But my challenge to everybody in the U.S. and my challenge to the president, to everybody, is I don't want to go back to where we were. I want to go forward to a better America. I want to go forward to a better place. I think we learned in this epidemic a significant impact in African Americans. I think we learned the impact of health disparities. We've seen health disparities in this country for a long, long time. Maybe it's time that we use COVID to address health disparities and actually we go to a better place. We get to a better America, much that is an America that is more equal, an America that gives better opportunities to people, and that really works together in trying to control an infectious disease like this one.
Do you feel a sense of heaviness?
Yes, you do. You feel the heaviness, you feel the uncertainty, you feel powerless, right? And I think what we hate in our lives is when we have no control. And the lack of control is something that as humans is very disturbing. And you wish you could do more, but you can't. And you're trying to do the best and not always the best is the right thing. And you make mistakes and you wish you could, get on a plane and go visit your kids and your family and you can't.
What are some of the good things that you're seeing?
Well, the glimmers of hope is that number one, we are seeing benefits of social distancing and we're seeing real benefits. More hospitalizations are less than expected in many cities and mortality is coming down. I mean, in the country, if we hadn't done the things we were doing, we would have seen 1.8 to 2.2 million deaths. We're going to see 60 to 80,000 deaths. That is a huge difference. I mean, still 60 to 80,000 is a lot of deaths, but it's a lot less than 1.8 to 2.2 million. Number two, we're seeing people do things that we never thought it was possible, right? 90+% of the country is doing social distancing, and it's actually doing it without any police force like they did it in China. There's nobody, the police is not out there enforcing it, and people are doing the right thing. And I think that shows what citizenship is like. We're seeing enormous acts of kindness. I mean, I'm overwhelmed by the number of people that are sewing masks, that are sewing gowns, that are bringing coffee to and food to physicians and to nurses and to healthcare workers. The amount of acts of kindness that we're seeing is just overwhelming. I think we're also seeing what the benefits of science are. I mean, we discovered this disease late December. The virus was described early January. We now have tests. We have a vaccine. We have 70 vaccines being tried. 3 of them already in clinical trials in humans. We have multiple medications being tested. So science has really accelerated the way in which we can respond to this disease. Otherwise, you think without science, where would we be now? And I see as an enormous glimmer of hope the amount of international solidarity and of collaboration that we're seeing across scientists, across communities, across the country. I mean, to have people, go to New York to help out there, to have people, nurses in California willing to go, that they're not busy enough, willing to go to New York to help out. So the amount of solidarity and the amount of kindness that we're seeing, to me, are glimmers of who we really are and the humanity that actually is what we all live for.
I think it will change us in profound ways.
I think, like many of us, I've begun to realize that my personal relationships, the people I love, the people I care about, the people I work with, are far more important to me and far more integral to who I am than I had ever realized before.
People have been using the word social distancing through this pandemic right now. I think that's a misnomer. I don't believe we should be socially distancing at all. We have to physically distance. That's what we have to do while we socially connect.
The chiming of the bells will have a special place in our collective memory. You can hear them as I speak. To send food and personal protective donations and things like this bell ringing from the university indicating support for the team, all of those are ways to acknowledge what, when you're in the moment, is a very, very intense experience. Caring for these patients is quite intense.
One of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves and our children will be to commit more resources, far more resources, to developing strategies for being ready for the next one of these pandemics, so that when, again, we are forced to confront something like this, we won't be scrambling. As a society, as individuals, as a culture, we'll be better prepared to meet it head on.
Hey y'all, I'm Aya Simone. I'm a harpist singer-songwriter, and I'm so excited to be here with y'all today. I'm only here for a few minutes, but I just want to, send love and good vibes and prayers to everyone who's at home right now that's tuning in, and all the people whose families have been affected by COVID. I hope that my performance can give you a bit of relief, a sense of peace and calm. So I'm only here for a few, so let's get started. This one is my arrangement of Stevie Wonder's My Cherie Amour. Thank you. That was my arrangement of My Cherie Amour by Stevie Wonder. Okay. Now here's some just like a little improvising. I think this kind of like chilling on. Autumn leaves. We're clearly in the spring now, or are we? Thank y'all so much. I'm Aya Simone.
let me tell you a little bit about Nikki. Nikki, her name is Lanika Barksdale. We call her Nikki. Everybody that knows her loved her. Called her Nikki. One of my youngest memories was her in the middle of our living room on Monica Street in Detroit. Maybe she was 4, maybe I was 3. Dancing with my Aunt Hester, keeping up with my Aunt Hester, who was well known to be a great dancer. Keeping up with her step for step, doing every move, knowing every song, knowing the rhythm patterns of every song. She was consistent with that throughout life. She studied modern dance when we were in school. And eventually she became a flag girl for a Detroit Cody High School marching band, which was very, very famous marching band at the time. And always was in the competitions, always was in the big parade on Thanksgiving Day. Then she had that flag and they would do the dance routines, and it was amazing. It was amazing seeing how much she was empowered and energized by that. Later on in life, Nikki had 4 children. Right now, their age is 26. That's Terry. 25 is Torrance. 17 is Tyree. And the baby girl, 7 years old, her name is Cassidy. So Nikki had a passion for any time she got to spend with her kids, any of her kids. A lot of energy, a lot of love, a lot of communication. Once again, a lot of laughter. But her other love was her love for dance. That's her recurring thing. That's her recurring theme throughout life. She became one of Detroit's ballroom queens. Some people called her the ballroom queen. Detroit ballroom is a style of dance that's not like your average ballroom. It's something with a lot more flair, a lot more energy, a lot more passion. And there are alternating moves that you can add in or take out. So the ballroom community here in Detroit is pretty big. So she became that floating butterfly on the dance floors at all of the ballroom spots. Just real smooth. She would glide. She would get crowds to come around her and watch her. A couple times I went to see her and couldn't get close enough to see her dance because there were so many people in between me and the dance floor. It was amazing to see her float. And it was amazing to see everybody on the floor in unity doing the same dance, same name, Detroit Ballroom, but different variations of it. It was almost like a movie within itself. So this was her life. This was her passion. When she had free time, this is the space she found to be in. This was her freedom. This was her wings. This was her exoneration from anything that she was dealing with or fighting through. This was her empowerment. So many of us get to live life without that thing, that one thing that makes us feel whole whenever we're doing it. Some people look for that for an entire life. She found it early, and I'm really happy for her that she was able to find it early. One of her last times out of the house was dancing. It's really hard to imagine my sister in another space other than this time and space continuum we know as Earth and physical property. It's hard to imagine that she's not somewhere dancing. However, the grief of losing someone so close, someone so interwoven in our family, that grief has hit my family in a very harsh way. As it is, I'm sure, the same way for many people who have lost family members to the coronavirus. We don't understand this. When she died in the hospital, My mother and sister, it took 2 days for the hospital to find my sister's remains. And then it found it really hard for us to find someone, even though our family members own a funeral home. It was hard to find someone that would prepare her body. So we had to work around that. My family is a big family, a big, beautiful family from Canada to the southern portions of the US and the west coast of the US. And we come together. We weren't able to do that. We were allowed 8 members in the funeral home at one time during my sister's memorial service. 8 members. For a funeral that on an average day without this pandemic probably would have had people down the block. That's how many people's lives my sister impacted. 8 people. I went to the family viewing on Thursday. I'm sorry. I went to the viewing on Thursday, which was open to the public, but still only 8 people in the building at a time. I stepped away and didn't go to the funeral to allow room for one of my aunts or uncles who helped raise us, like parents, like extra parents, to be there during the funeral. Imagine how many people can't go to funerals of their loved ones because they're overseas working or they're in the service. I couldn't go to my sister's funeral because there wasn't enough room, because there wasn't enough space, and not because it was crowded, but because of social distancing. So my nieces and nephews didn't have me. They couldn't hug each other at the funeral of their mother. We couldn't hug each other as family on the viewing day during the visitation. We had to stand in the parking lot to greet each other, and we stood apart in distance. We couldn't love each other the way we love each other. We're home grieving alone in spaces where we might be the only person in the home for weeks. This is not my method of grief. This is not what I'm used to. I'll get up and get on a plane and go somewhere. I'll go sit in a restaurant. I'll walk downtown and watch people, see them smiling and laughing and enjoying the weather or enjoying being out, or on the move, on a mission to get to work, whatever the case may be. This is not me. I don't have access to my means of grief and grieving. And I'm caught speaking to myself in 4 walls where there's no one else. So these are not regular times. These are not normal times. This is a horrible time to lose someone so close. And yet we still have to manage. We still have to, some of us work our jobs, and some of us, we have to still raise children. We have to do all of that in spite of what we're feeling. This is unusual for us.
The effects of COVID-19 on our world have left many of our fellow citizens heartbroken and devastated. In lieu of the tragic happenings, I hope that everyone has been able to smile at least once per day. I know it's not easy, and it's hard to think about smiling when we're constantly being updated on what's happening with the virus. So my offering to you comes in the form of song, a mighty song, a Motown song, a song that reminded me that this too shall pass. Hello, Detroit.
Hi, my name is Dr. Yolande Pierce, and I'm a neuroscientist and science communicator based in LA, where I work on dysfunction in the brain and trying to figure out ways to fix it. Outside of the lab, though, I'm interested in many areas of neuroscience and particularly passionate about interpreting and communicating science with a wide audience. On which note, I am so honoured to be talking with you today about some of the research around grief and the brain. So science is all about asking questions and systematically trying to find answers. However, when it comes to losing a loved one, that raises a lot of questions and there aren't always very satisfying answers. But I hope that by sharing with you this presentation today on some of the research into the brain and grief, I may be able to begin to answer at least a couple of questions that you might have from a scientific perspective. So 1, why do we grieve? And 2, how has the brain developed to regulate grief? So thank you very much for listening. I'm now going to share that presentation with you. Okay, so let's start with the first question. Why do we grieve? So I'm going to focus on grief from an evolutionary perspective. Grief is arguably one of the worst human experiences, yet we all experience it. And it's not just us. Reactions similar to grief occur in social birds and mammals throughout the animal kingdom in response to loss. In 1872, Charles Darwin described monkeys as weeping through grief. And since then, observations of animal grief have accumulated. So jackdaws and geese, for example, they frantically search for a lost mate and show signs of depression as a lack of interest in social contact. So in other words, they start to become really antisocial. And adult primates call out, become distressed, and show signs of depression when separated from a sexual partner or peer. And when zebra finches are separated from a sexual partner, there's actually a gender difference in that there is an observed increased activity in males and increased calling in females. Grief can be characterized by intrusive thoughts of the deceased, sadness and yearning. So intrusive thoughts, for example, are thoughts that just pop into your head uninvited. You may be doing something completely unrelated to your lost loved one, and then something reminds you of them, and then they come into your thoughts, which will typically lead to feelings of sadness and other grief symptoms. To understand how grief arose, we need to consider attachment theory and modern day evolutionary thinking. So these are two theories which I'm going to talk you through in this presentation. So let's start with evolution. So Charles Darwin's theory of evolution describes the way in which a species adapts to changes in the environment which present a particular challenge. So these changes increase the likelihood of their survival, and is achieved through a process called natural selection. So natural selection is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring, because in nature, reproduction is basically everything. All creatures ultimately are just trying to pass on their genes to their offspring. So traits that are found in lots of different species are described as being conserved and are usually very important because they are the traits that allow this to happen. So the question is then if grief is conserved across species, as I described at the start of the talk, then is it adaptive? And if not, then how did it survive the process of natural selection? If a trait contributes to producing an individual that is in better health or can obtain more of life's essential resources or can attract mates or produce viable offspring or feed and protect them so that they will produce more successful offspring, then it's more likely to be conserved. But when you think about grief, it doesn't really fit this description. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Features of grief such as poor health leading to higher mortality rates, loss of appetite, loss of weight, depression, increased alcohol and drug consumption, and loss of sexual interest and functioning all lead to lowering our ability to pass on genes. And the health consequences are worse when grief is stronger. There are studies actually looking at specific indicators of physiological stress caused by grief, such as secretion of stress hormones, and they seem to be increased following bereavement. There's also evidence supporting suppression of reproductive function as a result of stress following grief. And studies of the immune system indicate changes in immune cells that are also associated with depression. So when you take all of that together, it really points to poorer health following bereavement, which if this was our ancestral environment, this would adversely affect survival of the individual and their ability to pass on the genes. So it really does seem like grief is not something that gives us a competitive advantage. So if that's the case, if grief has such negative impact in this way, it really raises the question of how it could have arisen through the process of natural selection. How comes grief wasn't phased out through the process of natural selection? The answer is that every adaptive feature involves a trade-off between its benefits and its costs. Grief is a cost incurred in pursuit of something that has important adaptive consequences. And what is that? That's the importance of persistent social bonds when the individual concerned is absent. So this is where separation comes in. Reactions to separation have a very clear adaptive function because they aid reunion and maintain attachment to other individuals and promote reunification. So to give you a very clear example, if you think about when a mother goes away and the baby starts crying, the mother immediately, or give or take a few minutes, will return to the baby to see what the baby needs and to nurse the baby. So just imagine if when the baby cries, the mother doesn't return. The baby would have very little chance of survival. Now, while separation occurs frequently, death happens relatively infrequently, and therefore the mechanisms controlling separation reactions are not sufficiently flexible to be suppressed in the case of death. You see, for social relationships to endure despite separation, there must be a mechanism in the brain to cause social bonds to persist during separation. In the case of relationships, they involve the presence of an enduring mental model of the relationship, which is continually checked with the input from the outside world. So, for example, if you think about someone who you love very dearly, you have an internal model of that person and what they represent to you, what they mean to you. And when that person goes away on a trip, you miss them because you have that internal model, and then they return. And as you check your external environment, them being present, them being absent, them being and then returning, that checks out eventually. So that feeling of missing them is alleviated when they return. But in the instance of a permanent separation that is caused by the loss of that loved one, then you still have the same reaction to separation, but as you check your external environment to try and sort of reconciliate your internal model with your external model, a discrepancy occurs between the input and your mental model, and an emotional reaction like distress is what's generated because it doesn't add up. So you have this very strong internal model that is created in response to your relationships with those that you care very deeply about. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the saying, time is the greatest healer. And with regards to grief, I think that is certainly true. Although the process is different for everyone, generally, the grieving process is typically thought to begin with a period of acute distress and progress towards low distress over time, typically 2 years. But the thing is, it's not just time passing. in order to get to that place of increased level of acceptance, greater experience of positive emotions, normal daily functioning, and being able to integrate loss into everyday life, the brain has to remodel itself. And so that's what's happening when time is passing. The internal model doesn't just change when the individual ceases to be in the external world. It requires the gradual, painful process, grief, to achieve change in the internal model to conform to the new reality caused by the loss. I think this quote offers a very beautiful summation of all of this, that grief is a byproduct of these mechanisms whose primary function is to maintain social relationships that are crucial to our survival. So I want to turn now to the second question, which I raised at the beginning. How have our brains developed to regulate grief? So before I give you the answer, let's start with how we study this. So our brains are always active. Different areas of the brain are busy taking care of different functions. We can look at the activity in the brain by using functional magnetic resonance imaging scanning, or fMRI for short. And fMRI is really such a revolutionary tool for neuroscience because it measures brain activity by detecting changes associated with blood flow. So what has blood flow got to do with it? Well, cerebral blood flow is coupled with neural activation. So when an area of the brain is in use, blood flow to that region increases so that more oxygen can be delivered. And this is represented by parts of the brain lighting up, as you can see here in the orange and the yellow. So by carrying out the scan while a person is carrying out a particular task, we can see which parts of the brain is involved in the task and to what extent. And that's how we gain and have gained an understanding of brain function. So if you think about it, one way to study the brain in grief would be to put a person in an fMRI scanner when they're grieving and see which parts of the brain are active compared to a person who is not experiencing grief. But I think that anyone who has experienced grief, I'm sure will agree that enrolling in a grief study is not really at the top of your list of priorities. So that's where modeling comes in. So modeling is a way to gain insight into human brain function by studying something simpler that shares some characteristics to the true human situation. So for example, we can study people who have lost a pet to which they have formed an attachment. People, they do grieve the loss of their pet, and it is very similar to what happens when they grieve the loss of an individual. So by studying a person's grief in response to the loss of a pet, we can gain some insights into the processes that are happening in the brain in response to the loss of grief in general to another human being, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Or we can look to the animal kingdom and study animals that form attachments to their mates, offspring, or peers. Animals serve as a great model because in many ways they're not so different, and they allow us to systematically study things that we couldn't study in humans directly and in large numbers. So in nature, there's actually quite a few animals that form long-term bonds with one partner. So here we've got a couple of bald eagles looking very cute together, and a couple of penguins, a penguin pair. Both of these are monogamous. But try and get an eagle into a lab. Try and get two eagles into a lab, or a pair of penguins who belong in colder climates. It's very challenging. Here we have a couple of gibbons who belong to the species of non-human primates. And these are an example of monkeys that actually are monogamous. They rarely are unfaithful. They find one partner who they have a long-term bond with, unlike chimpanzees, on the other hand, who have a different approach. They live in multi-male and multi-female communities, and they promiscuously mate with each other all the time. But none of these animals are very practical models for experiments in a lab. However, here we have a prairie vole, which is the subject of some very interesting research into grief. So although non-human primates are our closest relatives, as I mentioned, they are trickier to study in the lab and there are some ethical concerns, but rodents are much simpler and more cost-effective to work with. So these prairie voles are the subject of some very interesting research into grief carried out by Dr. Zoe Donaldson at the University of Colorado. So her lab uses these creatures to work out how far they'll go to be reunited with a mate. While imaging their brain, they have really fantastic tools to do this. And so they are trying to understand what happens in their brains when they repeatedly fail to be reunited over time. Now, I don't have enough time here to go into detail about this study or the next, but I am going to talk very briefly about them in the next few slides. So in this study, Dr. Donaldson and her lab that I'm about to describe, they separated pairs of prairie voles and they trained them to press a lever, rewarding them by reuniting them with their partner. So I don't have a picture here, so I'll describe that. If you imagine a cage separated by a cage door and a lever which controls the door, if you separate this pair of prairie voles, then the one with the lever, the one in the cage with the lever, will eventually work out that pressing the lever lifts the door to the cage and allows them to be reunited with their mate. So that is very positive for them. That is something that's they are therefore motivated to do this, to learn this behavior. But what they did is that they then removed their partners permanently, such that pressing the lever no longer led them to being reunited. So now the prairie mole presses the lever and isn't rewarded by being reunited. So you can see how this is similar to what happens in the real human situation. So you have temporary separation and then you have permanent separation. And to take things further, they image their brains during these tests to find out which areas of the brain are active and involved in motivating the prairie vole to reunite and how this changes over time. So what they found is when being reunited is no longer fulfilled, this leads to frustration at first, but over time, the animal actually stops pressing the lever as frequently because it learns that it will not be reunited with its partner. And this is very similar to what happens in human grief as we incorporate the finality of grief into our lives. Now, for 10% of people, grief can continue for years, and that is a very difficult experience to go through. And I think this is described as complicated grief. And these animals have been instrumental in gaining insights into why this happens. So this research doesn't stop at just curiosity about the grieving process, but actually is being carried out to try and help those people who suffer from complicated grief. So animal studies allow us to quantify things like how often the prairie vole presses a lever and how much the brain lights up in certain areas, which then we can sort of relate to what's happening perhaps in the human brain. But you can't ask the prairie vole qualitative questions. You can't ask the prairie vole how it feels. So this model is quite limited to a degree. And that's where studies like this one carried out by Dr. Peter Fried and his colleagues at Columbia University and New York State Psychiatric Institution have been very useful. So this paper came out in 2009, but is still, I think, very relevant. So I'm just going to describe that. So what a person pays attention to influences their emotional reactivity. The incentive salience model describes how excessive attention towards an unavailable attachment figure maintains grief symptoms. So using this model, Dr. Peter Fried and his colleagues wanted to understand the neuromechanisms that eventually allow mourners to tolerate reminders of the deceased without symptoms arising. So in other words, how does the brain regulate grief eventually? So they had a few ideas. They proposed that differences in attention towards reminders of the deceased would reveal brain regions involved in mediating intrusive thoughts of a lost one. And one of the areas of the brain that they were interested in was the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped structure in the brain involved with the experience of certain emotions. You may have heard about the amygdala in the fight or flight response, for example. Now, they thought that people reporting high levels of intrusive thoughts on exposure to reminders of their loss have very active amygdalas. They didn't know this, but this is what they thought. Whereas those that have fewer intrusive thoughts have less amygdala activity, and the brain regions that regulate the amygdala modulate these grief symptoms. So that's what they hypothesized. So to test their theories, they carried out a brain scan during an emotional Stroop test on people grieving the recent loss of a pet. So what's an emotional Stroop test? Well, here's a schematic of part of an emotional Stroop test. And an emotional Stroop test reveals bias towards reminders of the deceased by looking at reaction times. So subjects viewed 4 blocks of control words alternating with 4 blocks of deceased related words. Each word was presented for 1500 milliseconds, and the deceased related stimuli consisted of 16 randomly ordered non-emotional words that remind the subjects of their pet. So for example, dog, leash, bark, but not friend. So no emotions attached to those words. And 16 control words, such as words relating to the house, a pan, lounge, deck, as I've used here, but not emotional words, again, like comfortable. And the subject had to respond as quickly and as accurately as possible regarding the ink color. So what they should be paying attention to is the ink color, but because the ink color pertains to specific words, deceased words, and control words, the challenge is going to be slightly different. So I'm going to just give you an example. Imagine I'm the subject in this test and I've recently lost my cat. Well, when I look at the deceased words, what you might think is that when presented with the word dog, leash, and bark, rather than being able to say red, blue, and green, apologies, I might stumble. I might say dog instead of red, or I might say blue because I'm distracted instead of red. And then when it comes to the next word, leash, I might say leash by mistake, or I might just take a little longer to report that that color is blue. And the same with bark, which is green. I might stumble on the word green. But when I look at the control words, then I may not find it very difficult to just say red, blue, green. So that's the emotional Stroop test, and it's really important that they had these control words, because while they were carrying out this emotional Stroop test, they were looking at activity within the brain. Okay. So they carried out the emotional Stroop test, and after that, they asked the subjects to undergo 8 minutes and 40 seconds of mood induction. So imagine walking your dog, and this was part of a later part of the study. Now, what they found when they looked at the subject's brain was really interesting, because it took the subjects longer to identify the color of deceased words than it took them to identify the colors of the control words, and they made more mistakes. So that's what they were sort of expecting, what they would have predicted. But when they looked at the brain imaging results, they discovered that this was associated with activity in areas of the brain, including the amygdala, thought to be involved in, for example, representation of self and others, and areas involved in separation distress and unattainable reward, just to name a few relevant brain functions that are all involved in intrusive thoughts. And what was really interesting is that when they looked at the brain regions responsible for regulating those regions, they saw differences between individuals in the level of functional connectivity between the regulatory regions and the regions associated with these intrusive thoughts, like the amygdala. So what they found was that people with greater attentional control, in other words, with less attention bias and decreased sadness, had high functional connectivity between regulatory regions and the amygdala relative to subjects who had greater grief symptoms. And so what's important to take home there is not that, everyone's brains function in the same way, but that there is some sort of neurological process whereby areas of the brain are involved in intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts lead to grief emotion, and that there are regulatory regions which control those areas that have stronger or weaker functional connectivity that might change over time. So you can imagine over a 2-year period, during an acute phase, there might be very little functional connectivity between those regulatory regions and the regions of the brain responsible for giving rise to, allowing intrusive thoughts or mediating intrusive thoughts. But maybe as time passes, that functional connectivity get stronger so that they are more regulated, so that there is less attention bias and therefore less intrusive thoughts and less emotions associated with grief. So that's, I think, a really interesting story to think about. But what I find surprising is how little is actually understood about grief. I think it's really important to underline that. It's a really complex emotion, and we still don't know a lot about grief, although there are lots of research efforts towards gaining a better understanding. However, I think our ability to look at brain activity in humans in response to grief and the availability of animal models means that we really are beginning to learn a lot more about grief, and that's promising. As we talked about in the beginning of the talk, without attachment, there is no grief. Our attachments are so important to us, and they're key to our survival. So while grief is a very high cost to pay, I think one comforting thing to take home is that for the majority of us, our brains, even though we don't fully understand how, are really busy behind the scenes in the time that passes during grief, adjusting to life without those that we love. And for those that do suffer from complicated grief, there is dedicated research to trying to understand why the process is more difficult and a hope for effective interventions. So I'll end the talk there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this incredible event, Science of Grief. Thank you very much again.
What's happening, everybody? My name is John Collins from Detroit, Michigan, DJ and producer with Underground Resistance, an international techno label. Also in Detroit, I'm on the Detroit Entertainment Commission, appointed by Detroit City Council, and also a board member of the Detroit Berlin Connection. Thank you for tuning into our online Science Gallery event with Detroit, Atlanta, and Dublin, Ireland galleries. Please join me live on Science Gallery's Instagram at Science Gallery Detroit as I DJ live for you. Get your dancing shoes ready. Can't wait to see you. All over the world.